Hi everyone, welcome to the Future of Finance panel at Milken. It's a very broad topic, the future of finance. I thought, as a thought experiment ahead of this panel, I thought I'd go back to the 2008 Milken conference program, see what people thought the future of finance was then. I found lots of talk of ETFs, and of managing volatility, and of the disruption that was going to be caused by bloggers. Obviously, a little less than 10 years ago, it wasn't even clear that there was going to be a future of finance as we then understood it. But things have changed a lot. And to help us peel back the layers of what is the future of finance, we have 5 brilliant leaders and innovators here on the stage, and I will briefly introduce them going from your left to right. We have Mike DeAddio, who is the president and COO of WorldQuant. We have Dan Barclay, who is the co-head of Global Investment and Corporate Banking at BMO. Lara Warner is the Chief Compliance and Regulatory Affairs Officer at Credit Suisse. Paul Hamill is the Global Head of Fixed Income Currencies and Commodities at Citadel Securities. And Ali Milan Nekmouche is the Chief Data Strategist at 2 Sigma. So, to help us sort of navigate the future of finance, I thought I would ask you, Mike, to kick us off and just sort of help us define some terms. So when you think about the future of finance, and particularly when you think about it now as opposed to a year ago, what do you see?
Well, as we were discussing just in the ready room before this, and we were talking about what it was 10 years ago and 5 years ago at the conference, I think we all realized that we don't have crystal balls and we really have no idea what the future is. So it's very difficult to predict that far out. So what I think we'll be talking about here, and I want to lay the groundwork for a little bit, especially how we at WorldQuant look at the world, is the basic tenets of finance being really a completely data-driven environment and world. When's the last time you saw an 18-wheeler pull up next to Credit Suisse and weren't out with any products, right? We are a pure data-driven business. Is that you start with the data, it's critical, it's always going to be there, but what you find out is now it's exploding. Everybody, we're all data sources. Not only are you a data source, what's inside your phone's a data source, but for those of you who have been swabbed by our wild Cornell friends outside, what's on your phone is a data source now. And so in the financial world, you have to start taking this onto account. You have to have a strategy on how you do it. And if you're not doing it differently than you were last year or the year before, that's a big challenge. And I think we'll talk about that. And then the second thing is talent. And then this is pretty global, but data does a lot more of it, but it's noisy. It's people that turn data into value, into signals, into things you can do things with. And notice I didn't say AI or machine learning yet. Those are tools. It's still the people, and how you access the people and where they come from and how you find them. If you're not innovating there, and I think we'll talk about this later as well, then that's going to be a big challenge. And we were talking about earlier, it's not just your STEM majors, it's not just your economists. We have microbiologists who are starting to work in our financial worlds. So we have to think about that as well. And then the last thing that we look at is you find the people, you get the data, you have to unleash them. You have to unleash your smart people. Command and control, top-down hierarchical organizations don't work anymore. And I think all the innovative organizations out there are really looking at how they manage their people and how they unleash them to achieve all these things. So from there, I will hand it back to you.
So Dan, how does this look to you coming from a corporate and investment banking perspective? What's the future of finance?
Sure. I mean, I think in lots of ways we talk a lot about disruption. We talk about things that are going to change. And the perspective I would share is that we are, and I think most people on the panel will get to the same place, we are embracing these changes. And by embracing the change, it's actually a partnership model, it's a service model, it's a contribution model. And it isn't something where we're going to wake up 10 years from now and all of the big banks are gone and all the big quant funds run the world. What we're going to find out is that there's actually been more disintermediation. We're going to have more interesting ways to make money. But what you'll find is that most entities that are looking forward and want to adapt will adapt, and they will find a way to reinvent themselves, which is what most financial institutions have been doing for 20, 30, 50, 100, 200 years.
When did you realize that you needed to reinvent yourselves in this kind of new data, world of data, though?
Usually, like all good things for a bank, we got it from our clients, right? And you're out talking to clients, you're actually doing business with them. And a good example, WorldQuant here, is innovating themselves, and you watch that innovation happen, and you could try and fight it, or you could try and adopt and find ways to work together. And I think that's typically how most innovation happens. There's a spark, and then you either embrace or not.
So Laura, you see this from a different angle. One of the great things about this panel is that everyone's coming to this question, or they're asking different questions of the technologies that moves ahead. What question, sitting from your compliance regulatory affairs role, what questions are you trying to answer with data?
Well, I mean, again, I think what's interesting about the financial industry is we basically do two things. We serve our clients, and hopefully in a way that allows them to have a strong return on investment and grow their wealth. And we also are risk managers. And I think that one of the things about the future of finance and what data and technology will absolutely do, I think, is enhance our ability to ensure our clients get great performance, because I would argue that has not been great lately. But then obviously risk management, which is what I do. Look, I think that the most difficult thing in compliance is, if you think about it, in my organization, we've got a couple of thousand people trying to make sure that millions of our clients and millions of our employees are able to function in the way that regulation and policy require them to function. And also that we understand the risks that are out there in the world and navigate that and bring in the right clients to the firm. That's a very difficult kind of hand-to-hand combat. You can't do that with people. So in a way, risk management is built for technology. And most firms have used technology in, I'd call them, more traditional market and credit risk spaces. But now there's a really great opportunity to do that in compliance and regulatory risk, which, as we all know, for the last 10 years, there's over $300 billion in fines to the industry for conduct risk. And so we're all trying to manage that risk, which economically can be a big issue for the banks.
And you guys are doing some quite exciting stuff. I remember your colleague, Brian Chin, was here last year talking about how you were basically using something that sounds a bit like Alexa for compliance purposes. So what kind of stuff are you actually doing? What does this look like in the real world of Credit Suisse's compliance department? Yeah,
so a couple of examples. So one is compliance on demand. If you think about compliance, it's people wandering around the floor helping the business navigate risk. Much of that can actually be put on phones such that people can effectively, Siri a question and they have it on hand. And I think our industry needs to get better at, again, a pull approach versus waiting for a human to show up at the right time to give you the answer. The second thing we're doing is, and one example is obviously, I think Brian talked last year about robotics. Flash forward 1 year, we have almost 100 robots in compliance, and we now have what we call baby bots and clone bots, which are, in effect, what we're learning is that solving a problem in one part of our process, taking steps out, making sure we're doing that quicker and actually creating strategic impact for the business. There's other applications of that exact same issue in the firm. And so the exponential move, frankly, to have smoother processes, not overburden the business with controls that are unnecessary, is a huge economic benefit for the bank.
Can I just ask, what's a baby bot? I haven't used that term before.
A baby bot is effectively taking a piece of a process that you created for a traditional bot and applying it to a different problem.
Got it.
Yes.
So Paul, you were talking on this topic last year at Milken. What's different this year? Like what's on your agenda when it comes to the future of finance and technology adoption that maybe you weren't talking about last year?
Well, now we use Alexa to trade swaps, and that's working really well for us. I think the thing that's really interesting for us is there's definitely a war for talent that continues to go on. We've seen post-crisis competition really rebound among our competitors, big banks, that would be in that case. And so what I see every day is that smart people want to work with other smart people, and they want to be working on really interesting things, especially the top talent. They can go anywhere. When I think about who we compete for in talent, it isn't so much the kind of, let's say, more legacy vintage of Wall Street employees it's probably more AI specialists, data specialists, and we're competing with Silicon Valley and such like. So, one area, and then there's the day-to-day stuff we do, sales and trading, and that's us and our clients. And sales and trading for us or our clients isn't the most interesting thing in the world. And so one area I see us continue to focus, I think will be a big focus in our industry, is really just efficiency. I think, I don't know that the things that people do will change all that much in day-to-day sales and trading, but I know that what we can do is continue to keep investing in technology in ways that really separate out the high-value tasks from the low-value tasks, and that's something I think we've done very well so far. And that's a big part, honestly, of how we attract the best talent away from, legacy, perhaps slightly dysfunctional platforms. They want to come to a new platform. Most people know how it should work, and they know it would make it better. And one of the things we do very well is invest in that so that the process is good for us and our clients, and people want to come and be part of it.
So, Ali, I want to ask, you have like now 1,400-ish people?
1,400 people, yeah.
So, what do they do? Walk me through what you're, because you are big data personified, if you like. You're kind of at the sharp end of this shift. Like, talk me through who your people are and what they're actually doing on the database.
It's very humbling to think of us as on the sharp end. It is sharp. We have 1,400 people, yes, and I'll give you the secret formula for what they do. It's data plus technology to the power of science, and I'm only half joking. If you think about the industry over the last 14 years, it's been fascinating to see really the data-driven method change its nomenclature. It went from just rule-based methods to nowadays we call it big data or AI or whatnot, but it's always been about this data-driven solution. And the investment management industry at large has always been about deriving insight from value-added data. And so if you go back into the 90s, you had the Peter Lynch's of the world that would pick up a phone and call the front desk of a hotel every morning or every night and ask if they had any rooms available to measure occupancy over time. Then you had Expedia come along, and suddenly you could measure occupancy across all hotels in one fell swoop. And nowadays, you can measure the energy consumption of a city block. And again, measuring occupancy. And so this has been sort of like the progression of the last 15 years, where suddenly you can measure economic activity at a much more granular level. And so what we really are focused on doing, and what we try to have our data scientists do, is find the world's best and most relevant data, give them the hardest problems, and put these data sets in their hands and hopefully find some value in it.
And where do you find them?
So there's a push and pull process for that. And as a lot of the panelists also alluded to, we think that a diversity of thought matters. And so, we run things like Kaggle contests. I don't know if for those of you who are familiar with Kaggle, where we've run data science competitions, and it's been one of the most well-received competitions where we've had people ranging from computational biology to nuclear physics, literally, take part in this challenge. That's led to some useful insight about the kinds of skill sets that can be valuable in the financial investment management industry. We're also very proactive in sort of like on campus and are exploring ways to train folks that don't necessarily have a data science background or a computer science background, but have very good scientific or otherwise creative studies. And teach them the core basics. And as our data and technology background or really platform grows, these people are becoming increasingly capable to add value in our environment.
So clearly talent and finding talent and bidding for talent is a crucial part of this huge shift. And PIMCO is now saying that it's going to hire 250 people, many of whom are engineers. It's almost odd if you're not saying that you're going to hire loads of people with kind of data in their job titles in some way. How do you see the state of the market for talent, like Mike, perhaps? Because you're competing with Uber and Facebook and Google, you're competing with healthcare companies, you're competing with Wall Street, everyone, car companies. Detroit is hiring data scientists.
And absolutely, I think that's one big change, and you've seen this not just over 5 years, but even the last 2. The people we see competing with, it's almost everybody now. It's not just the banks, it's not just Citadel, it's not just Two Sigma, it's all over. So if you don't have new strategies for finding people, and not even finding them, but find them at different points in their careers or in their school, then you start to lose. And we take a different approach where we look at the world and say we take the opportunity to where the talent is. So we're in 16 countries, we have 26 offices, we continue to grow that. And that's still not enough for us. We have, I mentioned Kaggle, we have our own platform where we have 60,000 users around the world. We're currently running a competition. We have 8,800 people signed up. We're going to do a global quant competition, and then each country winner is going to come to our championships, which actually happen to be Singapore Milken Conference. That's where we'll hold our championships. And it's all about finding talent bringing the opportunity to it, because that's the engine. That's the engine. And if you're not differentiating yourself there, and you're not trying to find new ways to get it, our competition's online, 80%, 90% are students. They're not even hireable yet. You get them before they get to senior year or finish their master's. Because if you wait till then, they're gone.
So is this a way of, when you describe the competition process, it almost sounds like you're basically getting people to work for free?
It's an assessment. When we actually get them to work for us, we do hire them, and we do put them on as consultants, and then we pay them. But you look at it as a massive assessment tool, right? And you can find people that you can't find anywhere else. There's a great anecdote. We have one of our consultants long ago. He's a 50-something-year-old farmer in Taiwan because he had to go back and farm. His son told him about one of our competitions. He turns out to be very good at making trading signals out of data. You can't find that person any other way. You would never find that person. So it is not only a war for talent, but it's a war with find unique talent. It's almost like alternative data. It's alternative talent. Where will you find it? And it can't just be the top universities in every place all over again. Right? You have to go and find new ways to get talent early and in very different places. We have an exchange program with Dr. Mason and Weill Cornell. We send a couple of researchers there every 6 months into work in genetic research for cancer. And then they send us a couple of interns every year just to cross-fertilize. And you have to look in new places for this kind of talent.
It's also the gig economy. You're bringing in a bit of gig economy to what you do.
I'm never exactly quite sure what that means, but in some ways, yeah.
They're like the Uber drivers of the. How does this work, Dan and Laura? Like you're coming to this again from a slightly different angle. How are you finding people, and you're competing with your peers, of course. You're also competing with people who are not in the financial sector at all. Like, how do you make the case that these smart young things should come and work for you?
I mean, I'm happy to start.
Yeah, go ahead,
You
Laura.
know, I think what's interesting about compliance, and again, I've only done this role for 2.5 years, is first of all, I think people are surprised when it's sort of the sexy place to be. So they're a little shocked at just how tech-enabled we really are trying to make compliance. But I think what's interesting about compliance is it has a mission within a corporation if you do it well, which is how are you protecting the strategic aspirations of the bank? That's our vision. And so I think mission is definitely important to these people. I would also echo, we do hackathons and other things over the weekend because this sort of contest mentality is definitely part of the DNA of this group of people. It's also a very interconnected group. They all generally know one another. They all, tend to connect very well. They're a very networked community, so I think word of mouth is also critical. And then I would also say that for a company like us, it's very, very important that we take this sort of feverish attention on data science and we find a way for that to light up the people that are already in our organization who maybe are not considered the cool modern data scientists, but are certainly programmers and developers who are capable of moving into this space. And I think that's also something that we try and do again. Hackathons, we actually did one. We had hundreds of people, but they actually came from all over the firm. And connecting these sort of innovation spark plugs within the bank also was really fascinating, and they did work for free over the weekend. We did get some really interesting applications out of it. So that's how we attack the issue.
I'm going to pull on a slightly different thread, which is, when we think about our wholesale business, our corporate business, most of what we give is advice, and it's advisory services. And there are definitely ways that we are applying data, applying technology to find ways to generate new relationships, generate intellectual content, generate new clients or better ways to serve the client. But in the end, and it's very, very old-fashioned, right? We are an advice giving typically in the hands of relatively few that give that advice. And so our talent strategies are all around how do you actually find, and I think the level of competition in data is probably even worse than it is for us. We think of it as a war on talent. But it's actually a grooming, training, managing, improving philosophy. When you think about a young banker that joins an investment bank today, they're not truly productive until they're 8 years, 10 years, 12 years into their career. And yes, we accelerate some faster and some don't make it. The industry's no different than others. I'd be curious to hear about turnover issues. We all have lots of them. but it's actually a concept of how do you find the right person that actually likes this industry and likes the business. There's lots of people that come in for velocity and a little bit of training and a little exposure, but it's actually how do you find that keeper or that special person that actually could give great advice or can actually build an intellectual client and think about clients is actually our key talent thing that we work on the most these days.
And what is the churn like? What's the turnover rate?
It's always cyclical. I think with young bankers today, or analysts and associates, or millennials, we're probably, in a great year down at 15%, at a high year, maybe as high as 30. And as you start to move up into the organization, it slows down materially. But I don't think it's uncommon for all of us to see churn at that level with somebody who's only got 2, 3, 4-year experiences. And I'm really curious about in the data world if the people are, hopping rapidly to try and find a different outcome than they would from a stability point of view.
So, there are lots of different motives then for working for a financial institution. Like, the job is getting more exciting. You're kind of giving these kind of competition, these tournaments that get people to bring out the type A personality and the people you're looking for. What about just money? Are you having to? I'll throw this at you, Paul. You seem like a man who's happy to talk about money. Is it getting prohibitively expensive to hire the people you want? Are you finding that the price of talent is going up because of the competition, or can you mitigate these things with like quality of life, quality of work, all that kind of stuff?
I think it depends on each of the different talent pools that you're trying to hire from. Certainly, I would say on the margin, our experience with the more sort of quantitative data scientific side of hiring comes a lot more down to the opportunity of the problem solving, the longevity. Things do matter, like location matters. Honestly, sometimes being in Chicago, it can hurt you relative to being in California, for example. But I don't think it's a dominant theme at this point. I think it's really about, what we see is there's people who know they're making a pretty important bet with that first choice. Is it Apple? Is it Uber? Is it Citadel Securities? And what they're going to do over the next 5 years is incredibly important to them. So I think from that kind of talent base when you're hiring them, it's not front and center. And we obviously pay very competitively, and we're a firm that's well known for compensating people fairly. Other parts of our business, if I think about just the basic sort of, I keep referring to it as basic, it's also very interesting. But on the sales, the trading side, the programming side, the desk quants and desk technologists, you do tend to be hiring from a more competitive environment there. We tend to base those people more biased towards New York. Some of the experience they have is going to come more from that Wall Street background. And certainly in the rates business, as a result of many big banks downsizing those businesses and then trying to reposition them, there actually is a pretty high competitive demand for that talent right now, and that's where I think we've seen most inflation.
Because there's been so much pressure on FIC generally to cut costs, especially in the kind of the big banks that have been restructuring quite painfully in some cases to bring the cost down. In a sense, you're doing that by moving more into kind of tech and efficiencies, but you're also increasing costs in different ways by having to pay up for talent.
Yeah, I think it's, if I think one of the challenges a lot of the banks face, and it's not like it's per design, it's just reality. If you think about a swap business 30 years ago, very, very people intensive, very, very low tech, and very much relationship driven, a lot of work and time going into each transaction, and then a slow moving process to get the transaction done. Fast forward to today, we will print and clear a swap in 20 milliseconds, and so, to price it, to get to just the whole thought process around designing a market making business for today's modernized world or fixed income, it's just totally different. And so I do think we're, in the fortunate position that we built at least a fixed income component of our business with a strategic view of where the market was going. I can see the challenges that banks must face in scaling up the kind of talent you need for the future, and at the same time scaling down the talent that perhaps you need less of as a result of those things coming online. I think that's what we see every day. It's a challenging thing to deal with.
John, I wanted to just jump on the compensation part of it, because someone, I think, said earlier, millennials, and we hire right out of school, so our average age of researchers is mid-20s, late 20s, and we run a lot of surveys, and we have offices all over, but regularly, the things that people come back and say, what was the best addition to your office, because we've made a big push here? Ping pong table. And I'm not kidding you. It really changes people's work environment, and they care. Kind of snacks. I know if you walk into Two Sigma's office, lots of healthy, good stuff.
Can you talk about the shuffle ball and the robotic arms? And
Right, we've got the competitions for the Xbox. And for those of us who are maybe a little older, and you see people walking by and there's like a bunch of people playing, soccer on the Xbox, you need to get okay with that.
This all sounds a bit
Because
2000.com era.
But it matters. It just matters, and it's
You have
not
to
just in
provide
the
them with a
U.S.
sandbox too, which is basically where they get to play on their own projects away from work. Because they like
These things are, as long as you hit to a certain level of compensation, it's completely changed now. And people care about different things, the work environment, their ability to collaborate, and playing ping pong lets them collaborate better. And so it really is a very different thing. I mean, we have issues where someone swung the ping pong ball and broke the TV. Those are the issues we face, but it makes a difference around the world, not just here.
And just to add a little bit on that, I think we find that people just like to solve hard problems. And the data scientists of the day, or whatever your academic field of study is, they look to join us because they believe that they can make the world better in one way or another, and they want to incorporate the new innovations that are happening. And so if you think of, sure, AI is an innovation, distributed ledger, we can talk about all those things, but when you talk about computer vision and you talk about, genetic sequencing and IoT, et cetera, and you talk about these things with your target demographic, I think they appreciate the fact that you're thinking about these new innovations and ways to incorporating them. So like when we've talked about some of these technologies, for example, one of our intern projects or discussions was about, could we use computer visions and AI, for example, to measure the facial expressions of CEOs when they come on CNBC interviews. It'd be pretty cool. Suddenly you take something that is very qualitative that previously you couldn't do in a quantitative manner, and you've measured it over time. Now you need a lot of stuff for that. You need data, you need the historical data for that. But if you're able to do that, you're sort of now augmenting the capacity of the quantitative machine, the quantitative process, the data-driven method. And it appeals. It's the kind of hard problem that appeals to the new generation of data scientists.
So you're basically, just to understand, you're talking about reading kind of facial tics on CEOs to find out if they're lying.
I'm just saying, wouldn't that be cool?
That would be kind of cool.
And this is
that too.
That would be cool for that too.
And this is why we have this exchange program with Weill Cornell. It has nothing to do with our main business. People learn different things, but they get to experience a different set of hard problems. The genetics problem is a lot like our business. Huge amounts of data, cannot process it all, very similar challenges. So there's cross-learning, but it's interesting other work that differentiates us.
So because you, Mike, helpfully dropped the M word, millennials,
I think you said it
going
first.
to not say. But millennials, and I don't want to make it sound like anyone who's kind of tech literate is necessarily young or belongs to a certain age group, because that's obviously not necessarily the case. But there is a kind of generational shift, it seems to me, where you have people in leadership positions, maybe from I'm going to draw this to you, Laura, an institution particularly like Credit Suisse, which has a long history in finance, senior decision makers who are steeped in finance, now managing people who are steeped in tech and who are learning finance. How does that work? What are the challenges of managing that shift?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think if I'd answered this 2 or 3 years ago, I would have given you a very different answer and the wrong answer. Because I think the historic approach was, put them in the organization, make sure we're clear, they have the weekend off, all of these sort of, I'd say, Band-Aid approaches to really introducing them in the organization. One of the biggest shifts that we've made that I've frankly been stunned at how successful it's been, and I think it is something that's generally used in more of the startup culture, is we are now dismantling really our organizational structure into what we call squads. So to answer your question, what we do is, on anything we're operating, we have our SME and our data scientist and our technologist and, whatever other people we need around the table. And again, what that does is two things. One, and by the way, you give those people a very decentralized set of capabilities to make decisions. They are not overseen by their management. So in a way, what we're doing is changing the organization much more materially to be something the millennial can operate in and actually thrives in. But as I said earlier, what's astounding to me is how quickly the people that have been operating in our company for 15 or 20 years just snap and will never, ever run a project or do any kind of big change program any other way. I mean, I have examples of, you know, compliance officers that have grown up and been in this industry for 20 years, and they're like, I'm never doing this any other way. And the other key part of who's in the squad is the business. So everything we do is us around the table with our data scientists, with our technologists, and with the business, the front office, so that whatever we do can potentially be used by them as well. So I think I predict that standard organizational structure will fundamentally have to change if you're going to be successful at operating in this new environment, if you're a company that has traditionally been, again, very vertically structured. And that's absolutely been our experience.
But it sounds like your experience also is that happen. People go along with it willingly when they see what it can do. So
Well,
you're not finding that friction where people are like, who are these young whippersnappers who are making you irrelevant?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, first of all, I think we're kind of a disruptive piece within Credit Suisse, and I think the success is making people curious and interested in what we're doing. But what I will tell you is we have a process we go through to sort of kick this thing off. We call it Inception Workshops. I'm sure many of you have heard about this. But when we first it's a 3-day process. When we first put these people in a room, I mean, at the end of day one, I always walk in and I say, I know you guys think this is a totally crazy process, especially the people that have grown up in banking. By day 3, people are charged up because they've got clarity on what they want to do. They've got, you know, as we say, minimum viable product or whatever they're trying to build. There's, you know, there's consensus around that, and it's just been an incredibly different experience. So eventually, yes, you know, there's a lot of buy-in, but I would not underestimate the journey can be quite interesting, you know, for people that have been in the industry.
Would you agree with that, Dan? What's your experience?
Yeah, I think we would have a very similar experience. One of the interesting pieces I'd share is we actually had a lot of what I call millennial blowback. And you know, when we were having some of the turnover challenges I mentioned earlier, we put in place layers and layers of ways to try and innovate, retain. I hate to say ping pong tables, but you know, tried a bunch of that. What we actually found out from our feedback from our employees in our surveys was they were tired of being labeled, right? Please don't treat me like a single cohort. And we've actually moved to something we now call the multi-generational management model, which is we're no longer trying to label or identify, and that would include gender, it would include race, it would include geography, where we're not actually trying to manage people in small slivers or into a cohort. I think we're seeing interesting signs of that working. I think a lot of it, you know, I'm interested on some of the stuff Laura said around really breaking down some of that hierarchical barriers, because I think we haven't tested that very much. But really, when we have gone away from treating them as a special class, we had a dramatic improvement in morale and engagement.
I just so to the point that Laura made. So we employ a team of teams approach, the McChrystal Group, very similar.
Yeah.
Let the teams form,
Yeah.
give them context, give them free reign to really look at this problem in different ways, and then just unleash them.
Yeah.
And I would say that the hardest thing is for us, because the whole model is eyes on, hands off.
Exactly.
And that's hard. Letting go has been the hardest part. And then you see the results, and you set the context, and you watch, but you have to keep your hands off. And so I think it's senior management that has the hardest part in letting this work, because people take to it. Once they see it, like that.
How much does the boss need to know of what the team knows?
We all work in regulated industries, right? So eyes on means there does have to be a lot of eyes on.
You have to
The
be ready to
compliance
put your
answer,
hands
he's giving
on.
me the compliance.
Right? No. But the way we handle it is there's reporting back, right? But the biggest thing is setting the context. And I'm assuming that's what your first day is, your first 2 days.
Exactly.
What's the problem? Let's define it. Let's get ourselves in. What are we trying to achieve? So then we're not telling you how to achieve it. We're just telling you what are our objectives, what do we have to worry about, what's our best, our outcomes, what are we looking for? And then if you think you're hiring great talent, you need to let them go do it. And let's say they do it in a way you wouldn't have done it, you need to be okay with that.
And just to jump in, why can you do this? Why do you want to do this? I think what is very different than the way we used to run the bank is the old way was business defines problem, technology goes off and tries to solve it. You know, 6 months later, we have a target operating model. 3 years later, we've spent $100 million on something, and it pops back to the business, and the business says no. I think the pace, and I mean, many of these companies are already doing this, the pace at which you can actually see the output of these groups does reduce the sort of the tension and the risk,
Yeah.
and in fact is in a way, a huge risk mitigation because they're able to come back so quickly with a solution that either, from a risk management or business perspective can be used immediately. So we're talking months, weeks, and the cost of these things is now dropping. I mean, we spend, we look at $300K, $2 million projects. We are not talking anymore about 50 million, 100 million. That's very suspicious, frankly, if you see a project of that
And
size.
it's okay if it fails then, because if
No,
it's
exactly.
300,000
And
it
it fails fast.
nobody's job is lost.
Exactly.
So fail fast.
Yeah.
This structure allows you to do that because not every idea is going to work.
Yeah.
Banks and fail fast are not words that one wants to
They
hear.
need to get, I think what Larry's saying is they need to get comfortable with that.
So we talked about the processes and the people. I want to just bring it to results. Talk about results, because if you're a kind of pointy-headed and narrowly focused investor, which of course is not necessarily a bad thing, you're asking, what is this going to do for me? Now, Ali, like in theory, like being able to read the CEO's facial tics should translate at some point into outperformance. You want alpha, you want your returns to be better, or you want your volatility to be lower. Is that happening? Are you finding that these strategies deliver results yet?
Yes. I think they are delivering results. We believe in the data-driven method. We've believed in that, ever since our inceptions. We believe in the culture of innovation. It does start with giving people room to think and the opportunity to collaborate. And we have this concept of think alone and think together. Which, you want people to really go off and invent, and at the same time come back and kick those ideas off of each other. And sort of fascinating when you see a natural language expert talk with a machine learning expert with an accountant, which is one of my backgrounds. And it's just like very interesting. The kinds of things that you decide on and the kinds of things you innovate are just quite intriguing. But I'll zoom it out a level. I think in general, the data-driven business is hard, right? And so it's hard. It takes 1,400 people. And it's not about machines taking over the world. It's about 1,400 people doing it. And the way they do it is, building excellence along each of those things, data, technology, and science. And just to give you an example of the kinds of biases we see or issues we see with the pitfalls with the process and what's hard, there's two things. One, data biases, and in what I call the infinite loop problem. On data biases, there's a paper that came out a while back that said that news mentions of Anne Hathaway were correlated to the Berkshire Hathaway stock. So you can't just take data, throw it at the AI machine, and then outcomes returns. You got to look at it. Otherwise, it finds spurious correlations, and then you have a hard time distinguishing correlations from causality or insanity. And to the infinite loop problem, I think anyone who's coded here before, I could do a raise of hand, but you've probably encountered at one point or another a situation where your code goes into this sort of situation of infinite staleness. It just didn't encounter the situation before and it's just there. And so humans and machines both have blind sides. You can't just assume that it works, and you have to build the protective measures around it. Our 1,400 people do that. They bring in their own nature of expertise, so be it in distributed computing or fault tolerance or machine learning, or just simply being a data geek, and infusing that healthy dose of skepticism leads to better results. So there's really no magic solution. We were talking about that before. There really is no magic bullet. But it's about having that dose of skepticism.
And so, Paul and Laura, you can speak to this too, but if you're thinking about how this translates into kind of a high return on equity for your business, which really sort of is a fairly helpful guide as to whether you're following the right path, and you can do that through raising revenue, cutting costs, etc. How is this actually translating into that goal of getting a better return from your business?
I mean, I think for us, when we started, let's take our interest rate swap market making business we started just several years ago. When we started that, the first thing we did was sat down and think, what's the problem we're trying to solve here? Because we're going to compete. Why would a client choose to trade a swap with me versus Goldman Sachs or JP or Citi or Bank of America? If I just show up and do the same thing, it is unlikely to result in the kind of market share and the kind of economic result that we want to have. We enter businesses to be in the top three. And if we don't think we can be in the top 3, we probably won't get into the business. So the problem we solved there, or with the way that we attacked that problem one way, was we decided to be the first to price every swap live or firm. Now what that means is there's a market, the swap market previously, every price was indicative. It was a rough indication of where you might be able to trade a swap, which tend to result in an interaction, a phone call, it's a fairly inefficient process. And we thought if we can just, cut a hole right through that and put every price on the screen fully firm and live, we'll massively reduce friction in the investor process, and clients will really get some time back, and they'll feel that we've added value. Our value will be obvious in the process. And I think, there's continued competition around that. I think that's still, today, we're still the only person that does that. And I think that, frankly, amazing that with the budgets the big banks have, that they still haven't really been able to compete with that particular innovation. And we now do the same thing for treasuries. So we keep building on it. We keep moving ahead. But there's only so many innovations you can make in a market where customers kind of do the same thing. They go to a dealer, they get a price for a swap, and they trade a swap, for example. So it's targeting, figuring out if I only have a few things I can do, they need to be very, very perhaps small and not that obvious, but they're going to make a very outsized impact. And I think that's one way. And I'll stop because it would be too long. But a simple way of saying it is, if you're going to price a swap live, if you're going to take down risk, 500 million 10-year swap at the click of a button, then the work that goes on behind that to get that price right is enormously important. The risk management, the use of technology, the use of data and analytics to have the certainty you need to put 400 prices out in the market all day long and say, trade, at will, is a very, very different approach to what our competitors do, and it continues to stand. And that's the best way in which it practically comes together. The end result for us has been, it's moved around, but let's say we have somewhere between 12 and 15% share of the U.S. swap market in 3 years. That's pretty phenomenal by any kind of measure, and that's how you get there.
What happens to your cost base, though, as that's happening?
Well, look, I think we built this business at a time when we believed that an enormous strategic shift was going to happen in the market, and that's what we invested in, and that's the bet that we made with our capital. So the cost base is kept low because when you start by taking all the inefficiencies, we never had the inefficiencies that other banks have. We started with a very efficiently designed model. So day one, we've probably got 10 to 15% of the people. We structure ourselves from a regulatory standpoint that isn't, doesn't have too many unnecessary binding constraints. I mean, for good reason, running a market-making business inside a bank is really not a particularly wise, or it's not the best way to do it. It's not how you design it if you were starting today, but that's because banks have had to hold more capital to make the world safer. Yep. So we've had the benefit of some of the things that have gone on, and I think we put some good bets on, and we made some right bets, not everyone, and that's how we've kind of kept the costs low as an example.
So Laura, in the banking world, I mean, people, I think that the kind of aspirational cost to income ratio is maybe like 50%, say, of your revenue being eaten up by costs. Can that come down because of some of these advances? Like, should we be thinking about, are banks going to get reach new levels of efficiency that make shareholders delighted?
No, I mean, absolutely. I think, again, there's two parts to banking, right? There's the performance side, which I think we're talking about marginal returns being better because it's operating on a scalable platform. And then you've got the risk management side, which, we actually presented what we're doing in compliance at our investor day to answer your question on does this matter on returns. And the comment was it was one of the more interesting conversations because if you just step back, what we talk about is the sort of iceberg of what you can see of the cost of compliance, and most people in this room understand how much compliance has grown. You've got, regulation has basically exponentially grown. You've had fines, again, that, mean banks are trying to find that needle in a haystack, whether it's the internal threat or the external threat. So the cost of compliance has grown, at least 10% a year, and I think, Citi talked about having 30,000 people. So there is an absolute cost where if you can replace all those people with better detective and surveillance capabilities, there's a huge opportunity to bring the cost down. But what we also talked about were the hidden costs of compliance. And just to give you some examples, because these are costs also embedded in businesses, but that businesses don't typically quantify. which is, again, what does compliance do? It tells the business what kinds of controls you have to have in place. The last 7 to 8 years, we've wallpapered so many regulations into businesses and created inefficiency. Second, on average, you're running investigations, you're hiring outside counsel. Those are costing 1, 2, 5, 10 million. Let's say you have 100 of those a year. Very easy to run a couple $100 million in a business. Then you've got, last example, whenever you put new controls in place, you hire people in the business to watch those as well as in compliance. So there tends to be a duplicative cost structure in the business as well as in compliance. So I think the answer is, if you can, again, and what we do is not only are we putting really great technology out in the detective surveillance space, but ironically, because we're operating on such a lean technology platform, we in compliance are actually now building front office productivity tools that have never been built before, because the old way of building those would have been so expensive that the business always prioritized something differently. So once you get on a platform like this, and again, these big data platforms are amazing because the marginal cost to create something is so small that, again, you can really create great efficiency throughout your firm at a very, very different price point and at a much faster rate, which I think is also really important.
It's interesting because a lot of people talk about disintermediation, disruption, but for the big institutions, you have such large balance sheets, you have so much capital and firepower that, as you say, you can basically use you're going to be the winners of this in theory. Like, you can buy what you like, you can build what you don't see potentially.
Well, maybe I'll tell you a tale, and this will tell you how old I am. But I came way back in the day from a company called AT&T. AT&T happened to make an announcement, I think, in the last couple of days on an acquisition they were making. I lived in that industry when we went through a similar disruption around broadband and wireless. And it's probably maybe not known to everybody that the company called AT&T today is actually not the original AT&T. AT&T ceased to exist. In fact, it was bought by a company called SBC, and they took the brand. So companies do die. And I think that while AT&T had a lot of great ideas, they never could kind of bring and adapt to the strategy, the disruption that they were seeing. So I think, on the other hand, companies like Comcast and companies, like the current AT&T are huge companies still and are able to buy a lot of this technology. So I don't think you can be arrogant about surviving. You must drive disruption inside your firm, and those large firms that survived drove the disruption inside their firm. If you don't do that, then you're in that classic incumbent's dilemma of, I'm going to spend all my time protecting my current business, and then someone will absolutely eat your lunch. So,
I just want to ask broadly, there is, in terms of finding the talent and the resources that you need to be a leader at this. There's clearly, in the US at the moment, there is a very clear agenda coming from the White House that the US should be a leader in, for example, 5G. So the decision to block the Qualcomm-Broadcom deal was predicated on the idea that America should be a leader of 5G. Now, when it comes to financial technology and the adoption of big data and in future things like AI, do you think that the United States is creating the right conditions to be a leader in those spheres?
I think that we have a visa challenge in this country because talent's global. And I think that it's going the wrong way personally. Now, it doesn't bother us because we actually have offices everywhere else. But if you look at that and you say, you don't have a lock on good ideas, you want to develop here for national security reasons or whatever, and I'm stepping way outside my zone, you need the talent here. And if you don't let the talent come here, then how are you actually succeeding? And I think that takes us a bit out there, but it's just not working. And if you see, I know the Silicon Valley executives have been pushing really hard on the immigration strategy. I mean, all of us, any of us try and get H-1Bs in here, it's a crapshoot. It's not set up in the right way at all. It's going the wrong way. We deal with it by just not bringing people here. We just leave them where they are and we set up shop somewhere else. But if you're looking at this from an overall US perspective, I think we're going the wrong direction because there's lots of smart people and they're not all here. But they would like to come here and we don't let them, by and large.
What are you finding? Your 1,400 people, like where are they? Like where are you finding that leadership is developing on a national level in terms of financial sophistication and.
Again, I mean, I think talent. So talent is definitely geographically distributed, and increasingly so. I mean, you can take online courses today, and Coursera is available, and you can become a data scientist anywhere, anytime. We have offices internationally as well. And, I agree that the visa situation isn't great, and I wish it was sort of somewhat more welcoming. But if your mission is to find the world's best data scientists and give them the best platform and opportunities really to sort of solve some of the hardest problems, I think the U.S. education system as a whole has really curated some of the world's best innovators to date. I mean, certainly China and other places have done amazingly well as well. And so we haven't really found a problem, I think, in sort of securing talent. We really have been very fortunate in matching opportunity with talent in general. I mean, I don't think it's that hard.
I will say, though, that when we bring them here, we educate them, but half the time they have to go back home.
Yeah, sometimes.
But we do have this education system, which we then export out everywhere else. And I think that's a challenge.
But a large portion of your workforce is in Vietnam.
It works really well for us because they get educated here. They don't know if they can get a visa after OPT. We have 15 other countries. So we can take them there, and that works really well for us. But if you look at the education system as a whole, to what Ali said, and we have a great education system, and so we educate the rest of the world's people, and then we make them go home. It just doesn't make any sense.
Maybe just to jump in, because I mean, half my life is looking and speaking to the regulators. I mean, I think, first of all, I think it's a very good question, and I think the answer is the United States is not doing enough to position themselves as a leader for financial technology. And in fact, I've had conversations with the Federal Reserve, for example, where I've basically challenged this very issue, which is, if you go to Singapore, they've all got financial innovation hubs. They're encouraging companies to come in and co-design. If you go to the UK, the FCA has got, co-design spaces where they're trying to understand technology. And I think in the United States, we're not moving as quickly, considering that so much of what is developed here in the US. And we've had very frank discussions with regulators that in the data-driven world, this will actually challenge their very structure as well. They're not set up to understand, and I speak to them about risk, that the risk that I will see is something that I can't even describe to them because they're so siloed now in the way they look at the industry that you'd have to get 6 of them in the room to really, really understand it. So I think it's an excellent question. I think the administration, at least based on what I've heard here at the conference, is trying to get more on the front foot, but these are, large institutions that are also very siloed, and I think, if we're not smart, other parts of the world are definitely going to move past us.
So does that mean, I think about China, for example, where, an e-commerce company, Alibaba, created the world's biggest money market fund, which you would never have seen coming. I mean, is the risk then that the future of finance is one that is no longer dominated by US institutions?
Absolutely.
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 I think, for what it's worth, the U.S. has the strongest, most vibrant capital markets in the world by a country mile. I think it's a little excessive to suggest we're going to get taken over. You only have to look at the recent implementation of regulatory framework in Europe, MiFID II. I mean, it's taken 6 years longer than it took the U.S. to implement the regulations.
I wouldn't compare us to the UK, though.
I said Europe.
I wouldn't compare us to the European.
But so I think that that's the only comparable that I can see right now, and it's very starkly apparent to us how different the two things are. So, I think I wouldn't bet against the vibrancy and the entrepreneurialism and the innovation that exists in capital markets in this country and has done for a long time.
Great. So we've got a minute and a bit left. I'm just going to run down the panel. What I'd like to do, I'm a journalist, and obviously we journalists tend to focus on the negative. We have an inbuilt negativity bias, some would argue. But I want to know, when you hear all of people are talking about artificial intelligence, neural networks, there's so much, there are many buzzwords. What for you is the thing that is most overhyped? What is the thing that we should be talking less about than we are at the moment? Ali?
I think, AI, distributed ledger, IoT, genetic sequencing, et cetera. All of these are tools that are looking for an application today. They're just independently, they're looking for applications. But in aggregate, I think they are the drivers of sort of the pace of change. So I don't know that they're overhyped. I think that they're important tools to sort of look at seriously to integrate in each of these industries. So yeah, I'm not sure they're overhyped. They're just, they need to be considered.
Got it. Paul?
I think this kind of concept of the machines taking over is a little overhyped. I think there's plenty of opportunity to transition people to different roles and higher value add opportunities.
Laura?
Just maybe the same thing, which is, this is automatically going to lead to job loss, and, it's going to be bad for the people in the industry. I think it will be, make our industry, I think, again, one of the most fascinating industries to be a part of.
I'd go with the word disruption. I don't think it's that disruptive. I think they're all going to be adaptive to make it happen.
And I knew I was going to be last because the AI one's been used so much, but I will give you an anecdote I learned at a prior conference. I think it takes Google 3 million pictures of a cat to figure out what the next picture of a cat is. It takes your 2-year-old 2 pictures, and if you put a red dot on every one you tell Google is a cat, then it'll think red dot's a cat, and your 2-year-old will never feed a dog biscuit or a cat biscuit to a red dot.
Amazing. Dog
There you
biscuits,
go.
you heard it here first. Okay, thank you to our amazing panel. I hope you'll seek them out and continue the conversation. Thank you for joining us.